Welcome back to the workshop. I'm Patrick from Douglas Fir Design, and today I'm going to be installing some hidden sauce hinges, these little things, in this cabinet. I'll walk you through the process of installing these and what I had to do to fix my own mistakes. So I hope you enjoy my folly. This record cabinet has a section in the lid, or in the top, that lifts up for access to a record player underneath. Now, I didn't want visible piano hinges or any European hinges, so I'm using sauce hinges. These little hinges need to be installed in a mortise. And I've created a little jig so that I can cut that mortise using one of these little mortising bits. Woodworking is basically just problem solving, and I've been told before, and I've told students, that the best woodworkers aren't necessarily the ones that don't make mistakes, but the ones who can fix their mistakes really well. Now, I don't think I'm an exceptional woodworker, but I certainly make a lot of mistakes, and over the years, I've had to figure out how to fix them. I was going to install sauce hinges in this lid, and spoiler alert, I did. I managed it. But I went in pretty confident that I just wouldn't have any trouble with it. I made this jig on the router table. I used a 1/2 inch spiral cutting straight bit, and I got my little piece of ply, put it along the fence and cut that slot. Now, I had to do some micro adjustment to make sure that that slot was exactly the right length, so it took me a few turns. The actual sauce hinge itself is about 13 millimeters, so it's a fraction larger than 1/2 inch. And so I just moved the fence a fraction of a millimeter to increase the width of that slot. But the slot in my jig will allow me to run the bearing of my mortising bit to create the mortise that I need in the lid of this record cabinet. The most important piece, really, apart from the accuracy of the jig, is the alignment, to make sure that those hinges in the lid and the rest of the top of the cabinet are in exactly the right position. So I'm going to position the lid within the top now, using some spacers, and mark out exactly where I want those hinges to be. Before I do a cut on my final piece, I'm going to cut this little piece of stock here to make sure that the process works. I've drawn a little line on here, which I'll match up with a line in my jig and clamp it on, and then slowly drop the router bit in height in a number of passes. Well, that's my plan. You get to watch along and see if it works to plan. So I used my jig to clear out that mortise. I had to adjust the height a couple of times on the trimming router, and now I need to figure out a way to mark that off really accurately so I can return to that height every time, because when I'm routing out the mortise in my actual workpieces, I'm also going to do it in multiple steps. And then I had to use a brad point drill bit to drill out the bottom bit of the mortise. Now, the accuracy of this bit isn't as important as the top bit, because this bit's not visible. It's also slightly tapered, so it's obviously not designed for a very tight fit. So that I was able to just remove with a brad point drill bit and then a chisel. And it fits great, really. It's like a fraction of a millimeter proud, but I can push that down just slightly with the router, and I'm ready to mark out my actual work and then install these in the top and the lid that lifts up. So I have essentially finished placing the mortises in the top of this cabinet and the corresponding lid. The process was a multi-step process where I did the mortise using the jig I'd made and the trim router, and I dropped that down in sections, ensuring that the bearing was always in contact with the jig. And then I went in with the brad point drill bit and removed the lower section needed for the hinge. And then I had to do a little bit of adjustment with a carving chisel just to kind of remove some of the roughness left by the router, because there's some sawdust built up in there. So up until this point, apart from the small fire I created in a mortise, I've been pretty happy with the progress. Until I realized that with all of my careful planning and the absolutely perfect placement of my mortises, that there was one key feature that I did not get right, because I have not done this particular hinge before, which means I'm essentially going to have to move these mortises. And I've stopped and had lunch and come to terms with it, and I'll describe what I'm going to have to do to fix it. So, I placed these mortises centrally in this 25mm piece of timber because I thought that made sense. But what I did not check is the distance between the two hinge elements and which dictates how close the hinges need to be to the edge of the timber. And I'm not sure if you can see from here, I think you probably can, there is not enough space for the opposing piece to fit in here. Basically, there's 6mm of timber here, and there needs to be about 4.5mm. So what I need to do for each of these mortises is move them this way by about 1.5mm. And the way I'm going to do that is I've placed a 1mm or 1.5mm shim on the inside of my jig, which pushes that mortise towards the edge. And I'm going to have to recut them in exactly the same position and then use a tiny sliver of timber to shim the backside. Or I might actually glue a piece in first and reroute the holes. One way or another, I'm gonna have to move them. It is unfortunate, and it just goes to show that with difficult hardware or doing processes that you haven't done before, even people who are doing this professionally make mistakes. So much of woodworking is just figuring out how to fix those mistakes. And I'm in the process of that, and I'll probably chat through what I actually figured out once I've done it. Some other woodworkers mentioned that they were tricky, and I was so focused on getting these little brass hinges to have a perfect seamless fit that I forgot the most basic fundamental thing about a hinge, which is that it needs to open and it needs clearance for the leaves to pass each other as they open. Let me walk you through the way I messed this up so badly. This little jig allowed me to set these mortises, and I designed it to place this mortise exactly in the center of this 25mm piece of stock. But what that meant is when these hinges tried to open up, there actually wasn't enough space in here. So I had to add about 2mm of packers onto the jig, which allowed me to move the mortise over. But I couldn't just cut a new mortise because then it would be way too big. The first thing I tried was gluing in an additional strip into the mortise, and whilst that technically fit, it was really gappy here and here, and it just looked terrible. And then I did the proper way, which is I routed a full channel, removed all of those mortises, placed a new strip of timber in there that can't be seen from the top, and then reset the mortises entirely. You can actually see a slight line here where it's like a bit of a glue line that you can see, but the rest of it's basically seamless. That gave me fresh material to cut these mortises into. But an important thing to remember is that I needed to move these screw holes over by about 2mm, and that ran the risk of those screws just falling into the old screw holes. So I made some little timber pegs, some tapered toothpicks essentially, that I glued into the old holes so that there was material in there when I put the new holes in. I had to do that on all 4 mortises, and it worked. And now you can't really see that it's there. There's basically no difference between the elm I used to infill those mortises and the material of the lid. So I'm very happy with the repair now, but along the way, it was not a seamless process. I won't make that mistake again, and I'm sure I'll use SOS hinges again, but it might be a year until I do, depending on the jobs that come through my workshop. It just goes to show that even if you do this day in, day out, you still make mistakes and you've still got to fix them. And you just got to not panic and figure out a way to do it and do it right. And don't try to half-ass it like I did. You'll end up just fixing a second mistake. Thanks again for hanging out in the workshop with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. There's information down below on some of the products I've used in this video. We'll be bringing out more videos every week on all kinds of things, from installing hinges very badly to router bits, and often just whatever projects are in my workshop at the time, along with some techniques that I'm using on those projects. It's been nice to have you. See you next week.